Okay, so welcome everyone, and a quick note that we are recording, and the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects in particular to elders past, present and emerging of the Penal clan of the Awabakal people, of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides, and where we in the room are located today. Our speaker today, Anna Johnston, is Professor in English Literature at the University of Queensland. She has particular interests in settler colonialism, travel writing, and missionary writing in empire. Her many publications include the monograph The Paper War, Morality, Print Culture and Power in Colonial New South Wales, UWA Press 2011, and the co-edited collection Eliza Hamilton Dunlop, Writing from the Colonial Frontier, Sydney University Press 2021. Anna recently completed her ARC fellowship, Future Fellowship, The Laboratory of Modernity, Knowledge Formation and the Australian Settler Colonies, which traced how knowledge created in the early Australian colonies was circulated by print culture through imperial networks. Her monograph, The Antipodean Laboratory, Making Colonial Knowledge, 1770 to 1870, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press in 2023, I believe, in about a month, and stems from this work, as does her paper today, which is titled The Antipodean Laboratory and the Sea-Girt Prison, Print Culture on Norfolk Island, 1840 to 44. Anna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sasha, and it's lovely to be here, and I just want to add my acknowledgement to the Awabakal people and their knowledge traditions. This project that I've been working on is very much about trying to think about settler knowledge traditions and Indigenous knowledge traditions and finding the spaces at which they connect. And it's not a major part of my talk today. This is the least connected there, but you'll see that even here there are ways in which that kind of connection between those two knowledge traditions coming together sit behind just ghosting the corners here. But I also want to say thank you to Sasha for bringing me down, to Nancy for the school's support to do so, and it's just such a pleasure to be here and actually to see some of you face to face again, and to meet new friends and have some great conversations. So it's lovely to be here. So what I thought I would do is just kind of talk to you a little bit about the book as a whole, just for the first sort of 5 or 6 minutes, and then jump into the paper, because you'll see that this is one of my case studies that organises the book. From the late 18th century, the Australian colonies provided thrilling opportunities for the acquisition of knowledge, becoming a frontier of social experimentation that was of intense interest to the curious readers of flourishing print cultures that circulated ideas globally. The Australian colonies offered broad opportunities for participation in knowledge making and demanded new scientific taxonomies. And there were places where Britain could test its policies for managing people and society. In these experimental societies established on Indigenous lands, local officials adapted existing imperial strategies for containing and punishing the convict population to introduce techniques that were distinctly modern in their attention to reform. The distribution of books and the cultivation of literacy was an important component in reformist efforts to transform the colonies from a predominantly military society, characterised by the spectacular violence of the early penal system and frontier massacres, into a civil settler colony. The urgent task of dispersing Christianity and education amongst a convict population with low literacy prompted colonial chaplains and missionaries to agitate for prison reform. Efforts to convert Indigenous populations and overcome their resistance to colonialism inspired some colonial officials and religious personnel to learn the languages of the people they encountered. Indigenous people quickly added English to their linguistic repertoire and actively participated in settler processes of collecting and interpreting information, sharing knowledge about themselves, their language, and the lands on which they lived. New colonial geographies emerged. The Eora woman, Patchagarang, discussed with William Dawes around 1790 that officers had travelled to Norfolk Island, where an agricultural enterprise had been established to supply food for the struggling colony. Eora phrases "for England" and "to England" reveal a creation of a new contact language that could accommodate Eora people's experiences, not only locally, but within the global maritime world that had invaded the shores of Camay at Botany Bay. Settler women too were also involved in agitating for moral reform in the colonies alongside religious personnel and visiting humanitarians whose concerns focused on both convicts and Indigenous peoples. And bringing these causes to public attention was a priority for a global humanitarian network brought together primarily through print technologies. Print cultures circulated knowledge about convicts, Indigenous peoples and the natural world in a period before modern academic disciplines had been established, when scientific authority was still being established in the public sphere alongside the private societies that had sustained elite curiosity and inquiry before the 19th century. My argument in the book is that the Australian colonies provided the setting for new kinds of knowledge about the natural and social world, an Antipodean laboratory, I call it, that provided data and experimental sites for collecting and testing knowledge. So the book focuses on three different intersecting fields of inquiry that I argue distinguished the Australian colonial experiment in the first 100 years. Humanitarian concerns with Indigenous welfare under imperial expansion, convict populations within new settler societies, and natural history and the scientific challenges of southern environments. Each topic generated streams of correspondence from Australia and created a vibrant print culture written by those keen to participate in a global knowledge economy that united colonies and metropolitan centres. Paper followed colonial expansion, like disease followed the ships. Letters and various forms of print culture were foundational to the Australian colonies, and they carried distinct knowledge specific to the establishment of Australia and its influence on European ideas of modernity. Many Britons had a keen interest in the reform of Anglophone society in the period and looked to the modern settler colonies for sources of information and inspiration. Their passions were matched by expatriate Britons keen to make a name for themselves in new colonial societies and back home. And so participating in a global dynamic network of correspondence and print culture was key to the way in which settlers became colonial, accruing authority and experiences that marked them as new, distinctly modern settler colonial subjects. And so across the book, I'm interested in those three sets of knowledge traditions that are coming: Indigenous cultures, convictism and natural history, and the ways in which they influenced modern fields of inquiry, such as humanitarianism, prison reform and botanical science, and it's the middle one that I'm going to be talking about today. But interestingly, linguistic, literary, religious, naturalist and proto-anthropological networks worked together in the early colonies because the key protagonists knew each other and corresponded. Warwick Anderson suggests that the small scale of intellectual life in colonial Australia provides a unique opportunity to reveal how local circumstances can prompt and shape intellectual work. The early Australian colonies, particularly New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, also provide a focused set of relationships through which to trace how key ideas about colonies were constructed, not just as cultural representations, but as products of material constructions that reflect both the circuits of empire that connected them and how knowledge was transmitted through such circuits, including its filtering and transmutation. So knowledge formation is dynamic and dialectic in the cross-cultural encounters that accompanied imperial expansion. Data and ideas from Australian colonies made unique contributions to global debates on a range of issues, from scientific classification of the natural world and the construction of race to the role and necessity of religious tolerance. The Enlightenment curiosity that accompanied many of the early voyages in the region could be both genuine and naive, but it had consequences, including dispossession and violence, alongside intimate exchange and intellectual enrichment. Collecting data and recording observations were collaborative processes on the colonial frontier that involved Indigenous translators, guides and go-betweens working with elite and non-elite European interlocutors. And the study as a whole attempts to thicken the traces of Indigenous and other traditional knowledge custodians to analyse the colonial archive in a way that engages seriously with decolonisation as a reading practice. This book traces the kinds of knowledge that was generated from the Australian colonies, by whom and how, and the mobility and influence of that knowledge as it travelled through circuits of correspondence and print between colonial and metropolitan sites. So that's the preamble of the whole project, and now I'll jump into this particular case study about, that's the cover of my book, which I'm really happy with, a beautiful image which I can tell you about later, and I'll come back and show you that more time. In 1834, a convict letter writer addressed his wife and children from Norfolk Island, writing from this doleful spot, my Sea-Girt prison. He sketched his isolated position. On the beach of which I stand, a monument of destruction, driven by the adverse winds of fate to the confines of black despair and into the vortex of galling misery. Formerly a non-commissioned officer and transporter of insurrection in Yorkshire, the prisoner described himself as wearing the garb of desperation and the badge or brand of infamy, N.I., which being interpreted is Norfolk Island, the villain's home. Dramatic self-presentation. The Quaker missionary and botanist James Backhouse had collected and reported anecdotes from convicts whom he visited across 5 years in the Australian colonies. These letters from Norfolk Island convicts were published in the appendices to Backhouse's narrative of a visit to the Australian colonies. While many convict locales attracted sensationalist reporting, Norfolk Island held a significant place in colonial and imperial imaginations as one of the most extreme sites of penal transportation and secondary punishment in the colonies. In 1827, Governor Darling declared his intention for the Norfolk Island settlement to represent the place of extremist punishment short of death. Harsh labour, physical punishment, and moral desperation characterised the Gothic image of the island prison in the public imagination. This fearsome reputation, encouraged by the penal administration and furthered in the colonial and metropolitan press, haunted these convict letter writers. Convict revolts were not unusual on the island, and they were punished by floggings and mass executions. As such, the island functioned as a rich source of evidence and commentary about penal systems, their purposes and their outcomes. It attracted prison reformers such as Alexander Maconochie as much as it repelled many convicts and the public through its reputation. And so in this paper, I want to look at some of these diverse texts emanating from Norfolk Island in the late 1830s and early 1840s during Maconochie's appointment to Norfolk Island. And this includes a rich archive of convict narratives that emerged in response to these radical experiments in the remote penal laboratory on an offshore island. They were circulated through correspondence and emerged in print culture, revealing how colonial knowledge production worked in this instance to bring forward convict voices and experiences to support arguments for reform and change. First-hand evidence and lived experience from the settler colony challenged and modernised metropolitan practices of punishment and social regulation. In the process, colonial reformers contributed to the development of new fields of knowledge in the social sciences. However, convict writers insisted on bringing to public attention the considerable suffering involved in the emergence of new forms of knowledge. And they did so successfully throughout the colonial press and important metropolitan sites of law and governance. This next section is called Quaker Addresses and Convict Readers. That Yorkshire prisoner whose words began this section of my paper was only one of the convicts who corresponded with the travelling Quakers. The Quakers used published tracts to address various communities in the colonies, including addresses directed at convicts as a particular audience for their religious and reformist messages. In 1837, they published this address to the prisoner population. Motivated by evangelical beliefs, the Quakers foregrounded their emotional connection to the convicts and drew on their daily experience with them. We have felt much for you who are in bondage and have often, when opportunity presented, expressed our fervent desire that you might act as rational men and as Christians, and we continue to feel for you under the humiliating circumstances in which you have been placed through sin. Quaker's address was a conventional evangelical text, peppered with scriptural quotations and exhortations to acknowledge sin and change their lives. Backhouse and Walker believed convicts should admit and accept their transgressions as an essential stage in recognising and taking responsibility for their crime, configured sin, and then work to improve their lives in mortal and eternal realms. Yet their focus on prisoners' rationality and capacity for self-regulation reflected modern ideas about reform and sought to account for why some convicted people rejected the Christian message and refused to change their lives. While convicts had used the precious paper from such tracts and Bibles for various purposes, to roll tobacco into cigarettes and to curl their hair, some convicts read this print copy and reflected on it personally. One convict reader recorded his response, and it circulated through colonial and metropolitan print culture by way of inclusion in Backhouse's narrative. We can't know how many others read the Quaker's address and whether they were persuaded by its argument. But William, as he named himself, was an exemplary reader, writing a personal response from Goat Island in February 1837, less than 2 months since the Quakers published their address in Sydney. Goat Island was a convenient holding place close to Sydney and the harbour on which convict chain gangs were put to work building essential port infrastructure. The Wesleyan missionary George Langhorne was appointed to the island to instruct a group of Aboriginal men incarcerated following skirmishes on the northern frontier, and it was likely via Langhorne that the convict letter was passed to the Quakers. Langhorne was a trusted colonial correspondent through whom Backhouse had circulated the Select Committee on Aborigines report in 1838. The convict writer William described his privileged childhood in a pious home and lamented his open rebellion against religion in a brief confessional life narrative familiar in evangelical texts. He carefully explained his reasons for writing to the Quakers. He sought to convey the sincere thanks of a grateful heart for the interest you take in our eternal welfare and happiness, and to assure the missionaries that their efforts had grateful recipients. Casting himself as an unhappy exile, William welcomed the Quakers' sympathies and averred that their address had the function to proclaim liberty to the captive, to open the prison doors of our minds through acceptance of Christ. He lauded the evidence of providence that saw him assigned to tasks that required attention rather than rough physical labour, and quoted an apposite hymn to reflect on his shame and estrangement. This verse grounded William's report that Goat Island had been the site of peaceful contemplation of his misspent life that had opened him to God's forgiveness. Now, the Goat Island letter resonated with broader audiences through its exemplary address and appeal to religious readers. Extracted from Backhouse's narrative, the letter was shaped into a short tract issued by a Yorkshire Quaker meeting, joining the rich world of popular religious texts that underpinned the 19th century revolution in literacy and self-improvement. Priced at 2 shillings for a dozen tracts, this kind of evangelical print culture was designed for mass audiences. As Richard Altick notes, simply by making the printed word more available, the religious literature societies stimulated the spread of literacy. In this instance, the tract introduced an articulate and religious convict voice into the hotly debated public discourse about crime, punishment, and transportation, and authorised it by first-hand connection of both the penal experience but also the vicarious association with the Quaker missionaries who had enabled this text to return back to the metropolitan centre. And so we see how religious concerns intersected with the ambitious schemes of social reformers such as Alexander Maconochie, and each lobby made use of convict testimony in the 1830s to 50s as transportation became increasingly untenable in managing modern societies and those who transgressed their laws. The next section is called The Moral Experiment and Penal Science, Alexander Maconochie and the Mark System, 1837 to 44. The problem of how to reform prisoners and eventually absorb them into general society was a pressing and distinctive one for the Australian colonies. It raised key questions about society. Who was fit to edit a newspaper? Who could worship together? And who could own property and hence hope to achieve political franchise? Morality and corruption were held in tension in these debates. While the Australian colonies were the ideal laboratory in which to conduct this moral experiment, the lessons learned were broadly applicable to modern societies. Religious reformers and social theorists in the field were acutely aware of this potential to extend their influence. Ambitious and curious men saw the Australian colonies as providing opportunities for intellectual endeavour and personal advancement. Alexander Maconochie, you can see here on the right, was a prime example. He travelled as private secretary to the Van Diemen's Land Governor Sir John Franklin in 1836, observed and critiqued the prison system there, and successfully lobbied to be appointed to a new post, which ended up being as Commandant at Norfolk Island, where in 1840 to 44 he implemented and refined his mark system of prison management. When recalled to Britain in 1844 because his new system encountered considerable colonial resistance, Maconochie wrote a steady stream of publications to promote his scheme, appeared before parliamentary select committees to defend his reputation and extend his influence, and along the way inaugurated many of the foundational modern principles of penology. Maconochie's contribution to prison reform has been well studied, and the various success of his schemes in practice has been documented by convict historians, political scientists and sociologists. Most recently, Hilary Carey has situated Maconochie with a series of reformers working towards the end of transportation, paying particular attention to his religious motivations. I situate him here in a slightly broader context around his intellectual interests and connections. Maconochie's naval background and his wide-ranging intellectual interests positioned him uniquely to observe the workings of penal systems. His connections with the Scottish and English Enlightenment and the Admiralty ensured that he was among the founders and first office holders of the Royal Geographical Society in 1830, and he was in fact the first professor of geography at University College London. Alison Alexander describes him as an ambitious, self-confident theorist. Maconochie's colonial career, shows both the value and inherent risk when proponents of reform took metropolitan concepts into Antipodean practice. Eventually, Maconochie's colonial methods were re-imported to Britain with questionable success but wide-ranging impact. When he arrived, Maconochie claimed not to have preconceived ideas about penal systems, but he'd actually speculated about the matter since 1818, so 20 years before he turned up. Maconochie believed that New South Wales settlers were ill-served by a penal system based on punishment and exile rather than reform. He rhetorically framed convictism as a violation of settlers' civil rights as British subjects and a contamination of their moral habits and feelings. More pragmatically, Maconochie was concerned that as long as it continued to be a penal colony, New South Wales could never become a flourishing commercial establishment, which was key to his vision of the Pacific as a series of linked port towns. You can see his geography training coming here. The fundamental principles of Maconochie's penal reform are clear. Prisoners' positive actions should earn them marks through which they would earn their freedom from servitude, de-emphasising the time spent under service. Prisoners would be grouped together in small, family-sized collectives to reward them for behaviours based on enlightened self-interest and social cohesion, as opposed to the separate system, another main passion of the time in penal reform, which atomised prisoners. So too, Maconochie shrewdly made persuasive links to other pressing social matters. The moral degradation of slavery that had been recently alleviated by abolition, but which still haunted the assignment system, in his opinion, and the economic benefits of a well-run colony with a properly mutual relationship to the imperial metropole. Maconochie shrewdly conjoined his interests with those of other penal reformers, such as the English Society for the Improvement of Prison Discipline. This Quaker and evangelical society built on Elizabeth Fry's work with female prisoners and was supported by the extended network of Quaker prison reformers, in which the Buxton and Gurney families were prominent. By 1835, it had become the most influential national voice regarding prisons, not least because of its command of detailed facts about prison conditions at home and abroad from Quakers and other sympathetic witnesses. Maconochie's observations and ideas developed quickly in the colonies, and he used sympathetic interlocutors such as Backhouse and Walker to build support for his own ideas about penal reform, appending their letters of support in his own submissions to the British government, and thus buttressing the moral authority of his scheme. Maconochie's Mark system starkly contrasted with Norfolk Island's history of extreme physical punishment and exile for prisoners classed as irredeemable. It was a challenging site for Maconochie to test his theories, but as a consequence, Norfolk Island became a highly concentrated laboratory of reform. Maconochie described his machinery there as raw and based on freshly formed theories. And from this Norfolk Island machine, streams of texts emerged by Maconochie, by various religious personnel who either supported or strongly opposed him, and distinctively by convicts, as well as visiting colonial official visitors and the colonial press. On Norfolk Island during this period, knowledge was used to produce the moral prisoner, rather than merely extracting knowledge about prisoners in the statistical schemas that otherwise typified convict administration. And Maconochie's education campaigns brought print culture into the prison. And this shifted the usual flow of knowledge between colonial and metropolitan elites. In reaching the public domain, these narratives challenged the tenor of the debate about transportation, imprisonment, and reform. So as part of Maconochie's penal science, print, musical and visual cultures and religion were critical to reforming prisoners. His equipment, which was sponsored by Governor Gipps, included a consignment of blank music manuscripts, scores of plays and musical theatre, including operas, musical instruments, and a library of books. Previous governors at Norfolk Island had built infrastructure such as granaries during their tenure. Maconochie's major contribution to the chapels for Protestant and Roman Catholic congregations included richly decorated imitation stained glass windows and large reproductions of religious-themed grand masters. The paintings were astutely chosen to communicate visually with non-literate convicts, while Maconochie strongly encouraged reading by providing a wide range of materials in his convict library. Now, I have the list of works that Maconochie ordered for his library, and they provide fascinating reading, particularly for a literary historian. And whilst Hilary Carey suggests that Maconochie envisioned himself as a Protestant hero leading a moral reformation, in fact, Maconochie paid quite cursory attention to moral and religious works for his Norfolk Island library, in comparison to his opinionated selection of broader literature. And indeed, Maconochie was critical of what he called the level of mystical importance attached to the one only persuasive employed, religious instruction, noting that while important, religion could mask the violence conducted under its name, especially in settler colonial situations. He was thinking about the Americas. Maconochie certainly included religious literature in his library, even controversial and potentially divisive tracts, because he believed it was the secular arm that puts the sting into religious difference, and he expected cordial cooperation of all denominations in the pressing task of reform. However, in 1846, the chaplain Thomas Rogers noted that the controversial and sectarian tracts are never asked for or read by the prisoners. By contrast, volumes of Chambers' Edinburgh Journal, the Saturday Magazine, the Penny Journal, and a few historical and biographical works are, he said, sought for and read with avidity. Now, these kinds of highly influential 1830s periodicals had created new readerships in Britain. The convict readers of Chambers' Edinburgh Journal on Norfolk Island joined the British mass audience for cheap but informative writing on history, religion, language, and science. And if you don't have any other questions to ask me about in question time, somebody must ask me about the right-hand side piece from Edinburgh Journal. I have a lovely little mind experiment about that. The Penny Journal and the Saturday Magazine both targeted working class readers, as did Chambers' Journal as well. This is Robert Chambers' magazine that was designed for working class and lower middle class readers. And as the journal progressed across its long history, it charted his increasing commitment to progressive social change. This was, of course, the Robert Chambers who was eventually revealed as the author of the Victorian publishing sensation Vestiges of Natural History of Creation. This kind of reading, encouraged by Maconochie, underpinned convicts' self-concept and the kinds of community that Maconochie sought to create. Maconochie provided very detailed advice about the material he wanted in his library and why it was important. He said, an uneducated man is newly born when his mind is thus awakened in observation and intelligence, even in the homely sphere to which his labours may be confined. So he ordered farmers and mechanics magazines, high-quality encyclopedias, works on agriculture, gardening and cottage architecture, and Sir Humphrey Davy's lectures on agricultural chemistry, William Cobbett's cottage economy, and other informative works. Narratives directed towards moral improvement he believed important because they taught, quote, energy, hopefulness in difficulty, regard and affection for our brethren in savage life, and etc. So these included Captain Cook's voyage accounts alongside modern missionary travel accounts and other Pacific voyages because, Maconochie said, the mind of the whole white race in this hemisphere wants softening towards its Aboriginal brethren, and nothing seems to me better calculated to supplement a sense of duty on this head than a familiarity with narratives in which they are placed in important and interesting situations without too much affectation. Reaching well beyond the text preferred by his fellow religious reformers, Maconochie recommended novels and poetry, sort of horrified Elizabeth Fry and Bagas Walker. They did mostly consider English drama to be licentious, but Shakespeare was fine because dramatic representation played an important role, Maconochie believed, in training the mind from complete ignorance up to knowledge, from the necessity of being read to the power and pleasure of itself reading. Nor were women writers excluded from his convict library. A variety of women, including Maria Edgeworth and Jane Austen, were recommended as part of a collection that invested country and home with agreeable images and recollections. Inculcating nostalgia and national loyalty through reading was Maconochie's direct aim here because he believed these were among the purest of human feelings. Stimulating these, he believed, would improve individual characters. So Dibdin's English songs and Moore's Irish melodies were intended to raise communal spirits through music making tied to national sentiments that would increase the attachment of prisoners to the mother country. Across all of the cultural forms he encouraged, Maconochie sought to mobilise Enlightenment ideas about the potential of art and sentiment to reconnect prisoners to society as English and Irishmen in exile, with a reasoned, affective and selfless attachment to Britain, rather than as permanently outcast convicts. This next section is called Learning to Write. I might just pause there for a second. Learning to Write on Norfolk Island. Prisoners such as the stage-mad convict James Lawrence and the well-educated musical instrument maker Henry Witten thrived under Maconochie's regime, especially when the Commandant supported the performance of an opera at the Castle of Andalusia to celebrate the Queen's birthday, accompanied by holiday and an allowance of diluted spirits and a celebratory punch. Now, this proved highly controversial in the colonial press and was likely a causal factor for his early recall, but he defended this celebration for decades, noting that convict men of number have since declared to me that it chiefly contributed to win them. It inspired confidence, affections, and many collateral feelings. Maconochie sought fundamentally to change the relations between the prisoners and including with those in authority, and encouraging these forms of cultural activity was central to his endeavour. Now, access to the library required a prisoner to use his hard-earned marks for the privilege, although Maconochie also awarded marks to those educated prisoners who volunteered to read for others in the jail, hospitals, dormitories and huts. The practice, he said, enlarged the minds of even the most ignorant and stupid, and by showing the use and value of being able to read, incited them to diligence in acquiring this power. Significantly, literacy offered convicts self-expression. Thomas Cook, a prisoner employed as a clerk, described how the Maconochie family tutor, Mr. Ring, worked tirelessly after hours in the tuition and instruction of new hands in reading, writing at a night school established for nourishing their better understanding and preparing them as worthy members of society. Thomas Cook, the prisoner, explained that when the tutor couldn't attend, Captain Maconochie, our mighty ruler, would substitute, superintending the advancement of his flock. Cook attested the value of learning to the men. Progress made by them in the art of reading writing, to which they had previously been perfect strangers, was truly wonderful. he estimated that 300 of the 600 new prisoners under Maconochie's mark system regularly attended night school, despite having to forfeit earned marks for the privilege. Reading and writing may have been part of Maconochie's machinery of reform, but of course for the prisoners, literacy was also a technology of self-expression and advocacy. A set of 6 distinctive Norfolk Island convict memoirs have been preserved that were written in response to Maconochie's regime. And although some of those narratives remained unpublished, all engaged deeply with contemporary debates about penal reform and transportation and sought to make distinct impressions on them through their personal experience of the system. Most conform to a fairly standard genre of convict narratives from the period, but were distinguished by their relative historical viability in a literary market full of fakes, and secondly, by the notable ways in which some of these narratives moved from the highly distinctive situations of their production on Norfolk Island through the colonial press and eventually to metropolitan audiences. They also bore the marks of distinctive textual practices transported with the convicts. Cook, for example, was transported in 1831 for writing threatening letters to local businessmen and landowners in Whitchurch, part of the Captain's Swing campaign throughout southern England in the 1830s, resisting the low wages and industrialisation of agricultural labour. Hundreds of prisoners, of course, were transported for these political actions, and the Norfolk Island memoirs reveal a continuation of this written mode of expressing dissent, here re-enabled by Maconochie's reforms. Swing letters in England threatened landholders with violence and revenge. Colonial print culture too abounded with letters and petitions that sought to redress wrongs and vindicate actions, and prisoners showed of their awareness of a variety of textual traditions in their own writing. Literacy of some of the convict population on Norfolk Island ensured that they were well positioned to find in Maconochie's reforms ways of advocating for themselves, which proved politically potent and sometimes subversive of the penal system. Let my life preach, or the testimonies of my pen and lips will be entirely useless, the convict groom John Ward fervently attested in his memoir. His transportation voyage from Northampton jail to the Australian colonies across 1838 to 40 included 19 months in the prisoner hulk, the York, in Portsmouth Harbour. His account of penal systems included first-hand experience of the failed domestic solutions to crime and the crisis caused as transportation was successively ceased in individual Australian colonies. As June Slee notes, Ward's diary account reveals a vast gap between penal policy and how it was experienced by prisoners. Ward claimed that many on the hulks were in fact keen for transportation because it removed them from the terrible conditions on the hulks. This was far from the exemplary terror that many metropolitan penal reformers demanded of transportation. He arrived on Norfolk Island in May 1840, only 2 months after Maconochie had turned up, and he was an astute observer of his environment, noting his fortune in coming under Captain Maconochie's new experimental system, and had it not been for the bad ration, there would not have been much to complain of. One of Maconochie's reforms was to grant each prisoner a garden. Ward warmly explained how, in our situation, a garden was all to us, at least it appeared so to me. Ward described how, although imprisoned on Norfolk Island, he was free from the bustle of the world, and thus to me it is liberty, and so I aim for the improvement of the welfare of my soul. Ward was one of Maconochie's exemplary readers. And in addition to Altick's rich description of religious literature as a ubiquitous part of the English social landscape, we must also include those books transported in convicts' personal belongings. Ward was already well educated and literate prior to his transportation for burglary, having disposed of an extensive, perhaps ill-gotten library before he quit England, and he carried with him what he called a little book called James's Anxious Inquirer that his mother had given him. On returning from the Norfolk Island garden one Sunday, he read The Anxious Inquirer after Salvation Directed and Encouraged. This popular and widely translated book by the nonconformist minister John Angel James was part of the staggering volume of evangelical print culture in England. It had sold almost 500,000 copies, something we should wish for in our own academic publishing contracts. Ward recorded his considerable reading of evangelical texts. He was moved by Reverend Samuel Shaw's Welcome to the Plague and Farewell to Life, a cheery title published first in 1666 that did appeal to me during COVID shutdown when I was drafting this chapter. And after reading this book, Ward realised that his devoted, if not perhaps obsessive, attention to his English lover, Rose, had prevented him from paying proper attention to spiritual matters. Had I not come to Norfolk Island, Ward says, I should not have felt and seen thus. Perhaps because he would have been feeling and seeing Rose. There you go. The final section here, the Botany Bay of Botany Bay, convict writing in Downing Street in Birmingham Prison. Convict testimony and memoirs certainly influenced the chaplain Reverend Thomas Beagley Naylor's writing about Norfolk Island both during and immediately after Maconochie's administration. Naylor arrived in 1841 and became a keen supporter of Maconochie's regime, declaring it to be above all other means the best, if not the only means of uniting the conflicting interests of the criminal and justice. Ward, the convict, considered him to be an able and kind teacher, and Hilary Carey rightly suggests, I think, that Naylor and Maconochie together achieved a kind of spiritual liberation for some convicts, although she doesn't pay much attention to the convict's writing. It was most likely Naylor who strongly influenced that religious tone that we've seen of a lot of the Norfolk Island narratives. And he and Maconochie were adept at using print culture to influence public debate. After Maconochie's 1844 recall and replacement by Commandant Major Joseph Childs, Naylor used his personal experience and connections with prisoners to mount an influential print campaign on penal matters in official and explosive correspondence, such as his 1845 letter to Lord Stanley. Now that letter was titled Norfolk Island, the Botany Bay of Botany Bay, evoking the long-standing image of Antipodean moral degradation. And he relocated the locus of moral concern to Norfolk Island in the aftermath of Maconochie's recall and the inversion of social order that accompanied the breakdown of authority under Commandant Major Joseph Childs. There's a lot to say about this text, but I think one of the most interesting things is that it only got to the Metropolitan Centre because his wife, Charlotte, personally took it to London for printing as a pamphlet. Maconochie, who had recently returned from Norfolk Island and was really keen to restore his reputation, met Mrs. Naylor and intercepted the manuscript, suggesting the extreme impropriety of publishing it before bringing it to the attention of the government. He took it to Earl Grey and volunteered to attest to its veracity. And through that process, Norfolk Island got closed down in parallel with a domestic inquiry as well. There's a lot more I can say about that, but I'll skip to the end. So Naylor emphasised that both his decade of experience on the island and his personal interaction with convicts provided the authority of this colonial testimony. And he removed the details of the moral challenge posed by Norfolk Island to the broader question of British transportation. To hint, he said that the whole thing is wrong, that British money has been wasted, British sinews sadly misapplied, the recovery of British criminals woefully overlooked, and worse than all, the penal policy of the British nation deservedly execrated by the world at large for her slovenly attempts at penal colonisation. But perhaps the final word should go to Joseph Jones, one of the old hands on Norfolk Island. These men were technically excluded from Maconochie's experimental method, but Jones wrote a passionate and articulate apology for the old hands at Norfolk Island and presented it to Maconochie on the 20th of December 1840. He warmly welcomed Maconochie's system, perhaps suspiciously so, but it was not only convicts who deserved reform in Jones's mind, but instead the corrupt settler society in which they operated. The British voice must be heard, he said. The whelp must crouch under the chastisement of the lion, and the colonists must attend to the instructions of the parent state or be punished for obstinacy. The voices from Norfolk Island were diverse and at times contradictory, but they resonated with astonishing rhetorical power. Thank you.
So, thank you for a fascinating paper. I open the floor to questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I learned very much because these are all themes I do not know so closely, and I have one main question. So I myself had studied, explored quite a lot of missionary, let's say, activities, also the discourse, etc., especially American, but also European, but in the Ottoman Empire of the 19th century.
Yes.
So a lot of aspects are very comparable. But my question, how far now? This all appears to be very intra-imperial. How far did these figures project futures beyond the empire? That's something that is much more present in the literature and in the concerns, because anyway, Americans and Europeans or Swiss or Danish, and so they were not within this sphere. And so was there, I always thought about a Protestant international as a very general concept, starting in the 16th century.
Yes.
And how much was there a Protestant international that these discourse, the printing culture was also in exchange, let's say, with Ottoman missionaries, missionaries in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, look, I totally agree with you, Lucas. I think that Protestant revival was a genuinely global imagining of a world that could unite believers in diverse locations. And I think some of the, iterability of the discourse, I mean, it was designed to be a connecting language that connected believers regardless of social circumstance. And I mean, I've done a lot of work with that. And of course, each of those kind of discursive habits and practices took a slightly different complexion in different places. And I suppose in this project, I'm trying to think about Australian texts and what's distinctive about the Australian nature of the material. What's distinctive about the texts that moved from Australia, and what were the distinctive contributions that evidence was seen to make to global discourses. In terms of empire, I mean, the missionary. This why I've been working on missionaries for a long time too, and it was why I always thought they were such interesting figures in empire, because they both were of empire, enabled by, employed by sometimes, but they were also often critics of empire as well. And so particularly in Australia, I mean, the early missionaries the early missions mostly failed, the series that was sort of established up until the 1830s. And they failed in part because they weren't well supported by the colonial state, and sometimes not very well supported by the home missionary societies either. So they're out there doing quite experimental things, but without a real neat embedding within either colonial society or the imperial project. And so certainly some of those missionaries ended up being critics of empire, and therefore enabling their converts, giving them access to a kind of language in which they were perfectly happy to support, criticism. And Indigenous letter writers, were taught to read the Bible and use that English language capacity to write petitions to the Queen to protest their conditions. So I think that the Protestant print culture, imagines a global universal connection. It has particular local variations which colour its distinctive conditions of production and circulation, and that it gets caught up in political regimes such as British imperialism at some points, but is often wanting to exceed it, which I think is where your comment is.
It's on the margin.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's why I think it's so interesting to think about both religion and literacy as sort of technologies that could be used for different purposes by their users, because they were, it's the silly cliche, right? To give a man a fish, teach a man to fish. But you give literacy for one set of purposes, conversion, say, and then you've got a literate convert who can then use that. They can use it obediently to reproduce pretty expected narratives about conversion and salvation, or they can use it to petition or write letters of complaint, or they do both, right? I mean, that's mostly what happens, they do both.
Thank you, Anna. I wanted to sort of explore this question of literacy amongst those in secondary punishment. I was under the impression that at the beginning of the transportation system, the convicts were reasonably literate, but as time went on, they became less so. And so I'm very interested in this period in the 1840s where, first of all, you can find convicts who are writing. And I wondered what people like, not so much Maconochie, but perhaps his opponents, were, what their views about convict literacy were. Did they see it as a threat and as a potential for revolution, or did they prefer that they would rather not see them having access to literacy, and how that operated on Norfolk Island?
That's a really interesting question, and I think, yes, I mean, I'm really interested in that question about literacy, and increasingly so, because there is this figure quoted, and I think Tim knows the same source, that says, you know, that you're quite right, that there were varying levels of literacy, and there was certainly literate convicts and illiterate convicts, and the convict records are good enough that we could go through those, and that's a big job, which I'd love to get somebody to have a look at for me and kind of map that over time. But then by 1890s or 1880s, 1880 to 1890s, the claim is made that 91% of the Australian population was literate.
Yes.
Both men and women, and that by the turn of the century, 100% literacy. That to me is such a fascinating figure, and I don't know, I've tried, it was one of those figures you quote, and happy to have it, and then thought, how verifiable is that? It's by some really good critics who should know, but I would love to be able to.
It's not 100% now, is it?
No.
No, but what is literacy is another variable, right? So, yeah, so one of the thing I'm really interested in thinking about next is how that literacy develops, and so this, you can sort of see me thinking about my next project when I'm doing this work. So, so something happens, and you know, I'm thinking about that work that Janet McCalman and Hamish Maxwell Stewart have done about how convictism, when you do the kind of epidemiological comparison with the records, you know, that when you then look at the First World War records, you can actually show that the ex-convict Australians had better health, taller, better health outcomes, all these things from being in the colonies. And I'm wondering whether there's a parallel with literacy in that as well. And so I'm interested in thinking about what the mechanisms of that are. And this is one subset of how literacy was encouraged. I think it's a really unusual location. I mean, everybody from Reverend Richard Johnston, the first colonial chaplain onwards, had been telling convicts to read, and they didn't. And he got very cranky, and then he said, oh, now that you're freed, you could just see it as part of your job. And he said, no, but you're not given time to read. So there was that, and that's the international discourse around literacy and self-improvement and Protestantism. In terms of how other people saw it, the colonial newspapers were highly critical of Maconochie's experiments. They thought he was a crazy, left-brained, you know, person who gave too many liberties that the convicts took and abused. So that included all of the things that Maconochie did, you know, particularly giving them rum, watered down on the Queen's birthday, and doing an opera and teaching them to transcribe music onto manuscript, you know, and literacy were all seen as potentially threatening. But also that's tied in with, you know, who has control of the voice of authority, positions of speaking. And of course we know that, you know, George Howe, who had the first printing press, was himself a convict. And so all of those questions about emancipists and, you know, who could print a newspaper, who could be an editor of a newspaper, was it appropriate for an emancipist to be an editor? And, you know, of course the exclusives said no, you know, this was the worst thing. But they would say that because they wanted to control, you know, the public domain as well, and they had their own networks that they were controlling. And all of a sudden to have, you know, when in the 1820s, when the colonial newspapers started to be printed and could be critical and have different colonial opinions, everything got a lot harder to control. And, you know, the MacArthurs had done very well in controlling the narrative through their own networks. So it was seen as something threatening. But then on the other hand, there were a lot of people who'd come to the colonies, you know, by that stage as free settlers who were similarly lower middle class, plus self-improvers. And so there was a continuity, I suppose, across that sort of
Phil?
So, if I've understood you correctly, there are sort of two tensions within colonial society at the time, the reformists versus the punishment, terror, mob. And the reformists think that teaching convicts affect and sentiment is somehow going to transform them into better humans. Is that right?
And a better relationship with God. Through a better
Uh-huh.
relationship with God. Through a personal relationship with God.
So I'm wondering, obviously you talk about how these discourses have an impact on Indigenous populations, but I'm wondering to what extent that particular outlook, so those two tensions, spill over into the way colonial authorities are also handling Indigenous populations. Are there parallels there?
Yeah, look, there are. I mean, it's the early period before the later missions and reserves. So I always have to think that those missions and reserves are more entrepreneurial and based on European missionary societies implanting particular things. So, Lancelot Threlkeld at Lake Macquarie, for example, the only London Missionary Society outpost here, Church Missionary Society. So they're part of that globalising Protestant world implanted in particular places, and they do tend to bring with them quite modern ideas because they're part of this kind of Protestant thinking about a modern, educated Christian, converted self, and that's what they require the missionaries to write their conversion narrative, and then everybody in the congregation has their own recognition of sin and reimagine themselves in that kind of way. So certainly that carries across in the missionary society's engagement with Indigenous people. Most of which, as I was saying, in the early period, not so successful. Later half of the 19th century, increasingly as frontier violence pushes people towards the safety of missions. And so, Lake Macquarie became a site of safety for what we call Wonnarua and Worimi people, That was a spot where you could take a breath and regroup and do some work and then work out, what was going to happen next. So certainly that reform there. And, the example I always give here is Samuel Marsden versus just about anybody else, really. So Samuel Marsden, who was the second colonial chaplain and lasted, right through to the 1840s, had basically decided by about 1804 that Aboriginal people were totally irredeemable and unconvertible. And so he was very much, he was the flogging parson, he embodies the kind of 18th century spectacular violence of terror and, transformation through violence and repression. So he then, of course, turns his interest to the Maori in New Zealand and starts the Church Missionary Society mission over there. And just at every effort, when anybody comes to Australia, like Threlkeld or a whole lot of other people, and they say, oh, we're going to do this for the Aboriginal people, it's like, there's no point. It won't work. And so those two give you that kind of sense. And really Richard Johnston, who was the first chaplain, is much more like those kind of affective 19th century heart-based Protestant missions. But he gets totally, and I start looking at his address to convicts and Aboriginal, work with individual Aboriginal people, and he just gets totally run over by the penal colony, can't deal with the military, finds himself totally antithetical to the, very nascent formations of the state and has a mental breakdown and goes back to England. Marsden decides that he'll take the land grants, he'll buy the sheep, he'll work with the state and embeds himself in the kind of emergence of colonial polities from the beginning and shares the military interest in control and discipline.
Interesting.
One more?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got the room booked to 1:30, so we're not running against the clock.
Thank you so much, fascinating paper. I was really interested in the very negative assessment that you gave right at the end about the impact of the convict system overall. And again, looking to that group that Hamish Maxwell Stewart is associated with now, you know, they're giving a much more optimistic assessment of it, obviously, and one of them is that whole matter of reform, and they're saying, you know, that the ticket of leave system is really an early probation system, and that is one of the ideas that goes back from here to the UK as well, and that overall, really, there was quite low recidivism amongst the transported convicts. So I just wondered if you had anything to say about that, because I guess it's a very, as opposed to this sort of initiative, which is text-based and moral and so on, it's very practical. It's, you know, let them out there earning their own living. They'll have to step up, and if they want to feed themselves, they'll have to work, and then they have a skill set, and when they're actually released, they can go out and find work. Continue in those sorts of roles.
Yeah, that's right. I know, and I mean, as you would be able to anticipate, I've listened to Hamish's work, you know, over a decade, and really watched that big project emerge. And there's a lot about it that I think is absolutely persuasive. It is always based on sampling, which always interests me, because it carries a veracity of quantitative work, but it is sampled. And I don't disagree with any of their interpretations or findings. I suppose that it is the neoliberal kind of interpretation of the convict system, and that's not what these people are talking about at all. These people are talking about the soul, the self, the conflicts of being exiled. And I think those things can actually be true and can coexist at the same time. And a lot of these people, and I mean, a lot of the ones that I've been talking about are the more literate people who came with a set of, you know, middling level skills. And, you know, people like John Ward, who I quoted, who was talking about people learning to read and write, you know, he managed to write a petition that got him out of the situation. He got it to Sydney, he got a pardon, and then he started a good free life. So I think both those things can be true. But what I'm really interested in is how these convicts, you know, who are so written about and so controlled by the discourses of others, and in some ways continue to be so, but to hear their voices and to hear them commenting on the systems that they're involved in, I think is a really powerful corrective for us. Not because the numbers tell any lies, but it's that they were not unthinking, unreasoning cogs in a system. In fact, they had very strong opinions, and they were highly articulate about the systems that they were caught up in. And they were reading the newspapers, and they knew what people were saying about transportation. One of the, you know, I talk about metropolitan science. Didn't have time to go into that, but you know, a number of these convicts. There's one particular celebrity who was a celebrity convict. I think of him as he was a lawyer who got sent to Norfolk Island, and he eventually, gradually worked his way back by convincing colonial officials that his case had been misheard, and then he and another convict managed to get themselves to England 15 years later for the Select Committee and give testimony. And they want their voices to be heard, and they want them to be heard back in the metropolitan centre. And so I think alongside the kind of story of colonial success and thriving, there is also a kind of calling Britain to moral account for what it had done as well. And so certainly Joseph Jones is saying, you know, I mean, the lovely thing I love about that piece is that he's affiliating himself with Homeland. He's saying the settlers are the whelp that need to be disciplined, because he's then constructing an affiliation between himself and the British lion, literally. So, you know, these are telling much more complex and subtle stories about what they did and didn't get out of their experience of the British penal system, and really wanting its successes to be heard and accounted for back home.
Vicky.
Well, thanks, Anna. I'm wondering about women. The voices that you are finding in the texts are all male voices. Just wondering, is that actually the pattern?
It's Norfolk Island. So Norfolk Island really only had male voices.
Right.
So, yes.
And there's
they're elsewhere.
Well, you can mention.
No, not really. I mean, in some of the like the clergymen's narratives, some of their wives, there are some letters and correspondence. So almost everywhere else in this book, there's a lot more women.
Yeah.
But Norfolk Island only had male prisoners because it was this site of
Yeah.
degradation. And there are also all sorts of salacious stories, like Maconochie's daughter, like they had 8 children on the island, and Maconochie's daughter Mary got supposedly seduced by her convict tutor, and so there's a whole scandal about that, and a whole pile of people end up being involved in that both locally and internationally, because she kind of gets whisked off because she's the duff, and so there are those worlds as well. And so there's a really interesting domestic realm that's sitting beside the penal regime,
Yeah.
and I'd love to write a bit more about that. And I love the fact that it's Naylor's wife, Charlotte, who
Yeah.
physically, packs
Yeah,
the
that's- I
manuscript.
picked that one up and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, interesting.
And same with, Jane Franklin, she's another one of the kind of case studies in terms of the Tasmanian Journal of Natural Science, which is actually the first scientific journal in Australia, and it's produced, Alexander has done this fantastic work showing how that was pretty much Jane Franklin's baby, even though it sort of had John Franklin's, name on the front. But, Jane Franklin gets her sister, Mary Simpkinson, to have the issues of the journal bound in Morocco leather with a kangaroo and a platypus on the front and presented to the right, person in the colonial office when John Franklin's administration becomes on the nose. And so there's these really interesting ways in which women's networks and men's networks, which sometimes overlap, but sometimes they're just working opposite and just kind of at different levels. And so that's absolutely the case. This is an unusual case study because it lacks that bit. And so here the kind of really subversive stuff, which I cut out as I went along, is around male homosexuality. And there's a big discourse about that as well.
Other questions? Online or in the room?
Okay, quick one, just that did Maconochie had any relation or knowledge about Jeremy Bentham's essay, The Panopticon in New South Wales?
Yes, he did. And you might have seen here when I do a big bit on Bentham, you might have seen in that plan, it looks like a very Maconochie thing. And in fact, Maconochie goes back and writes a lot of tracts comparing his plans for reform with Bentham's.
Positively or negatively?
His are always better.
Just in your discussion, you contrasted Maconochie's approach that was more social and communal with atomized approach. And of course, Foucault's whole critique of the panopticon is that it atomizes.
That's right.
And so I was just wondering whether he had picked up on that or had any comment on it.
Yeah, and look, there's a whole pile of really interesting new work about Bentham and Australia, which is just coming out, as I was finishing this book. So there's a new special issue. UCL have done a whole digitising Bentham's papers.
Right.
And there's a new great book that just came out just as I was finishing this book about Bentham and Australia. I mean, I think a lot of the new work on Bentham suggests that Foucault's version of Bentham is not entirely Bentham's version of Bentham.
You could never say that of Foucault.
And but it's certainly the case. And I mean, the irony with Maconochie using the Quakers Backhouse and Walker and their letters to support his schemes was that they weren't absolutely sure about his methods. They were much more part of the separate prison thinking, a very religious version of that, in which a man should just sit in a solitary cell and that will make him think of God eventually. I mean, it probably would, right? Just before you went mad, you would decide to convert and then everything would be fine. So they weren't absolutely sure about this much more liberal cultural approach to reform. But that's why I was sort of gently tic-tacking between the way that Maconochie's been picked up as a religious reformer, and I think I love Hilary's work and I agree with a lot of it, but I think she kind of over-eggs his religious interests. I think it was really a mechanism for him. And I think when you look at the books, I mean, there's no way that the Quakers would have been bringing in Walter Scott, Jane Austen, poetry. That was absolutely the opposite to what they thought. They would have said tracts, the Bible, waiting for God to speak to you and vice versa. So there are alliances that Maconochie's, I think, very cheeky in kind of connecting up. And then this lovely thing that he says, oh, you know, Elizabeth Fry told me to correspond directly with her. And it's like, well, she may or may not have said that, but he had decided that that was going to be a useful kind of connection for him, and was quickly told he should be going through official channels first and not sending information to Elizabeth Fry, which would have helped her to kind of argue for different ways of things happening. And Maconochie was a chancer, right? Like, he got into so much trouble in Tasmania because he stuck his report in the governor's dispatch bag without actually telling him that he was doing it. And so the report that went through ended up being quite critical of Franklin's management. But Maconochie was a much shrewder reader of metropolitan sentiment than Franklin was. And so really Maconochie's ideas about what was happening in Tasmania kind of won that particular argument. So he was interested in, sorry, it's a long way around. I mean, they're all very interconnected. So he was really interested in Bentham's ideas, but he saw his as better, and he would publish these things where he'd say, you know, Bentham says this and I say this. And so they're almost kind of doing a refutation. So. And Wakefield is the other very important reformer at this time. So Edmund Gibbon Wakefield and his ideas about moral colony, which of course he writes from prison himself in England, and imagines Australia and critiques the system there. So I think in terms of reformers, they're the three who are really important, but then inflected by these religious advocates as well. And of course the Quakers, the reason the Quakers were so interested in prisons is they were so often imprisoned themselves, because they refused to give oaths, because they thought that everything they said was true and before God, and they were seen to be free thinkers and free speakers. And so, and they often started newspapers and ran printing presses, so they were often convicted. So they saw a prison from the inside as well as the outside.
Right, we might
Time for the story then?
yes, about from the Edinburgh
Oh yeah, right. Thank you. So this is great, right? So this was one of the most popular things in the library, was the Chambers journals, and Naylor managed to get a piece published about Norfolk Island in Chambers' Edinburgh Journal. So he ended up having connections with Charles Dickens, and Dickens got very interested in Norfolk Island as well. And because there were all these metropolitan inquiries and law cases and things, it was all very much part of the public discourse by about the 1850s. So I love the idea that it was technically possible that maybe an edition of Chambers' Edinburgh Journal that featured a story about Norfolk Island could have got transported to Norfolk Island and read by a convict on Norfolk Island.
That was fabulous.
Stuff happened.
All righty. On that note, please join me in thanking Anna for an absolutely fascinating work. Just before you go, just a quick reminder that we have many exciting events, too many exciting events for me to list right now, lined up for next week, which is New South Wales History Week. But our next regular seminar will be on Friday the 15th of September. Our presenter will be Amir Moghadam from the University of Newcastle, and he'll be presenting on Communicating Violence, My Journey in Translating Talat Pasha. And until then, we hope to see you then.